This year, Congress has an opportunity to protect children in our schools and on our streets by passing my juvenile crime bill, which will ban violent juveniles from buying guns for life and take other important steps. We shouldn't let this chance pass us by. But protecting our children and preventing youth violence is not a job that government can or should do alone. We must all do more, as parents, as teachers, as community leaders, to teach our children the unblinking distinction between right and wrong, to teach them to turn away from violence, to shield them from violent images that warp their perceptions of the consequences of violence. We must all do more to show our children by the power of our own example how to resolve conflicts peacefully. And we must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send before they explode into violence. Surely more of them can be saved and more tragedies avoided if we work at it in an organized way with sensitivity and firm discipline. This weekend, we grieve with the families of Springfield, Oregon. We may never understand the dark forces that drive young people to commit such terrible crimes, but we must honor the memories of the victims by doing everything we possibly can to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future and to build a stronger, safer future for all our children. Thanks for listening.
"15-year-old Kip Kinkel, a 15-year-old schoolboy, angered over being suspended from school, opened fire with a rifle, killing at least one student, injuring 23 in America's latest bloody campus shooting."
Nothing could have prepared Springfield for the horror that befell it. A 15-year-old boy gunning down his classmates at school after shooting dead his own parents. As night fell, this small community was trying to understand, trying to cope with the scale of such a tragedy. The teenager who opened fire in the crowded school cafeteria is Kip Kinkel. Just the day before, he'd been expelled for bringing a stolen gun to class. He'd spoken of getting even. The shooting only stopped when Kinkel was overpowered by a member of the school wrestling team. They're hailing him a hero. He was shot at close range a number of times and seriously wounded as he pinned Kinkel to the ground. Distressed school children spoke of seeing Kinkel climb onto a table, pull out a rifle from under his trench coat and start shooting at random. When he ran out of ammunition, he reached for one of two handguns he was also carrying.
All day long, people have been gathering at the school, some to leave flowers or say prayers, some to share their grief at the tragedy. Others simply stand and stare in dazed disbelief. When you look at the faces, you see deep shock and utter bewilderment that such a thing could happen, and happen here.
Bill Kinkel was the type of man who loved being around people. A likable man who was fun, kind, and a good-hearted joker. People who knew him remember his infectious laugh. Bill loved to be active. He spent most of his time outdoors, hiking or sailing, and on the open road on his motorcycle. He was a socialite and a true people person. He was always ready to help if there was someone in need. Faith Zaransky was very much the same. She used to call herself a people pleaser, where she would always put other people first. She would do just about anything for anyone. She understood people and could almost sense what they needed. She would try her hardest to provide them exactly that. Unavoidably, sometimes the wrong people would see her kindness as a weakness and take full advantage, as people might do. But she had an iron skin and never held a grudge, opting to continue seeing only the best in everyone she met or knew. Both Bill and Faith were Spanish teachers, although Faith could also teach French. Language, culture, and tradition were fascinating to them both, something they looked at with equal parts awe and respect. With parallel values, it makes sense then that when Bill and Faith met during a business trip in Cleveland, that they would fall lovingly into each other's arms. The both of them were devoutly positive and progressive in their own right, and shared a love for life. On January 29, 1972, Bill Kinkel and Faith Zaransky would marry. They would come to call Springfield, Oregon their home, a quaint little town on the Pacific Northwest, and in the 1970s, straight through into the 80s, Oregon was mostly unspoiled by the proliferation of industry. The tight-knit communities were more like pockets of family, true communities where, when a hand was needed, you'd never had to look too far. Your neighbor, a friend, even strangers. Springfield in the 70s was idealistic and a true hidden treasure, nestled amongst the eclipsing mountain vistas and salty ocean winds. Like everywhere they went, Bill and Faith made a positive impact on their community, and quickly became well-known, almost iconic residents. December 22nd, 1976, and Bill and Faith welcomed their first child to the family, Kristen. 6 years later, on August 30th, 1982, Kipling was born. Bill and Faith shared equal vision on how to bring up their children, and it was certainly a unique take on the times. They truly believed in literature, and tried to always teach with love and guide with a soft hand. They wanted their children to experience the world with open eyes and hearts, and allowed them the ability and personal choice to take their own paths. Both Bill and Faith were strongly against violence and physical punishment. Instead, they surrounded their children with patience and understanding over the use of a strap or belt. In 1986, when Kristen was 10 and Kip 4, Bill and Faith decided to take a sabbatical in Spain. Both Spanish teachers, and Bill and Faith would have no trouble acclimating to the new environment. They had hoped the same for their children. Coming from a linguistic family of mostly overachievers, they had anticipated cultural hurdles and some hard adjustments, but had hoped the excitement of a new home abroad would help inspire adaptability, excel their children's desire to learn, and see the world from a new perspective. They packed and left for Seville. Bill and Faith would pursue higher education of sorts, Spanish teachers learning Spanish in Spain, and they fell right into the new routines once landed. Kristen also seemed to fit right in. She learned Spanish easily and had a large circle of Spaniard friends, many of which she still talks to today. She was a 5th grader on her home soil in Springfield, but in Seville, the only English-speaking teacher taught grade 3, and as a result, she was placed there. She didn't mind and adapted well to the curriculum. At 10 years old, Kristen was young enough to quickly learn something like a second language, and just old enough to recognize that this was a true experience. Kip did not fare so well. Already a child with trouble reading and writing, he had just started to understand these skills, and the sudden shift in scholarly focus was a jarring thing for him. Spanish wasn't something natural for Kip, which created even greater divides between him and his peers. All of it together made him an easy target for bullying, and Kip eventually just gave up. (1988), and the Kinkel family is mostly sad to be saying goodbye to their home for the last year, all of them leaving with precious memories. Bill and Faith had hoped that Kip might return home a new, happier boy, if not simply because they were finally back in Springfield. The hopes were all for naught, however, as Kip's growing defiance and short temper did not stay in Seville. Back on home soil, he was still uncooperative, and the distance between him and his parents could not have been greater. In school, Kip displayed continued slow emotional and physical development, and in 1989, after much discussion between parent and teacher, the hard decision was made to hold Kip back, and he was to repeat the first grade. Grade 2 and Kip's scholastic struggles continued. Written language was difficult for him. He was far behind his other classmates, and Kip started to feel this separation deeply. It distinguished him from the other students, and in his own family with 2 parent teachers and a sister who excelled at literally everything, Kip felt different than everyone. Recognizing there was a problem, Bill and Faith began pursuing alternative education with all the right intentions. Kip took the intelligence test, scoring above the 90th percentile, and was ultimately disqualified from the service. The testing counselor, however, reported that Kip had concerning scores on motor and hand skill tests. Most notably, while attempting to sign his own name, Kip struggled and displayed a high level of frustration and anxiety. It would take years, but Kip would eventually be diagnosed with dyslexia, giving some kind of closure and certainly a relief to the entire family. Now, at least, they had some answers. Grade 3 and Kip displayed a high level of competence in math, above average even. However, his trouble with reading and writing continued. He would be retested this year for special education, this time qualifying. He seemed to operate better under the individually catered instruction, receiving awards for outstanding improvement, earning no grade less than a B throughout the entire year. Special education would continue throughout grade 4, although he was also placed in the gifted program for math and science, where he still performed well above average. A savant of sorts, these subjects came naturally to him with very little effort. The father-son dynamic was something ever absent from the Kinkel home, and not for trying. Bill wanted desperately to connect with his son, to do all the things fathers and sons classically do, but Kip was never fully committed to the same mentality. The relationship was strained. While loving, Bill might have been overly insensitive, which were part and parcel to his era and upbringing. Bill was raised with an older sense of liberalism. Despite the breakthrough era of the 60s and 70s, he was still weaned on the days of men's men, and 90s rebellion was something truly alien to him. Still, Bill and Faith hoped Kip saw the loving, supportive, and trusting home they had hoped to create. Kristen thrived in this atmosphere, although Kip might have felt estranged. Bill and Faith tried to perpetually reach their son, finding windows when doors were locked, or even making doors where there were none. And to his parents, at least, Kip would not open up about anything real, and it was cause for concern. The only bridge between them was through Kristen, who acted as a kind of mediator, calming everyone down after blowouts and talking confident reason in a way that lifted tension. While she was at home, Bill, Faith, and Kip would have the unique luxury of invested support, and all 3 would confide in Kristen often, and she would listen, unconditionally. 1995, and Kip had started showing an interest in ballistics, knives, bombs, guns, and rifles. Coming from a devoutly nonviolent home, Kip's new obsession was a shock to Bill and Faith. They were concerned over this new obsession, and while Faith held strong against firearms and the like, Bill saw an opportunity to connect with his going wayward son, and together they would learn about firearm safety through some local courses, eventually leading to Kip's first rifle, a Ruger 1022 semi-automatic Bill had bought for him. Kip is 12 and entering grade 7 at Thurston High. It can be argued that grade 7 is the most formative of all school years. The struggle to define yourself, both internally and out, is unique to us all, but tends to follow the same path regardless, where the bonds formed between childhood friends either becomes even stronger or falls away as new friends influence and take hold. Kip, who had few friends growing up as it was, found acceptance among the more defiant of early teens, the probable outcasts. focused on breaking the molds and being purposely different. As Kip opened up to his new friends, he started to trust them and confessed progressively morbid fascinations. And amongst this new troop of underdogs and corner dwellers, his sentiments were easily accepted and never looked down upon. Scholastically, Kip still struggled with reading and writing, but showed a continued high aptitude for math and science. He was also a natural runner, and it didn't take long for coaches to notice. He was eventually asked to try out for the football team. Thurston had a long history of winning and was considered a prodigious team in the Oregon circuit. Feared for their prowess, being asked to try out was a big deal. Kip would make the team. This is also the year that Kip first started hearing voices. One day after school, as he walked home from the bus, he heard a voice behind him. He turned to see who it was, but no one was there. Shaken up, he ran inside, and the voice followed him, with a second voice chiming in, and then a third. "You need to kill everyone," they told him. He ran to his room and grabbed the rifle his father had bought him, gripping it tight. The voices persisted, speaking about Kip as if he couldn't hear them, reciting violent, negative things. The three voices had a hierarchy, and as Kip tried to make sense of them, he thought they might be God, or the devil. Kip did not say a word to anyone, and this marks the beginning of his obsession with weapons. At some point this year, Kip would buy a sawed-off shotgun from a friend and hid it in his room. Grade 8, Kip begins expanding his scope of rebellion and starts shoplifting. Small things from stores mostly, and like any petty criminal, he was caught eventually. Surprisingly, the overall discipline for his crime was light. A slap on the wrist from police, and at home, the traditional mix of stern disappointment and lecture. This time, Bill and Faith were on their own. Kristen, now graduated and pursuing higher education to reach her own goals and dreams, was no longer there, and the burden of communicating effectively with Kip was now solely on their shoulders. They felt a certain level of anxiety over what to do. Bill and Faith might have blamed themselves for their wayward son's rebellion, but the truth was far more complex. Influenced by outer forces, Kip hid his crusade from just about everyone and began surrounding himself with what he believed were the keys to his very survival. One of these keys, and perhaps the most influential, was a well-known book, banned in North America, the legendary Anarchist Cookbook. Its contents included blueprints for drug manufacturing, improvised weapons, and, most importantly, bomb construction. Somehow, Kip was able to find and buy the book, and once it arrived, he took to studying and understanding the content within, specifically surrounding bomb construction. Eventually, he surpassed the basic instructions and started streamlining the builds, fine-tuning detonators, and plotting out his own intricate triggers and traps. He kept this knowledge from everyone, his own secret, cultivating the skills he deemed necessary as his mental state declined. On January 4th, 1997, Kip was attending a snowboarding clinic in Bend, Oregon with a friend. At some point, Kip and his friend found time to explore, and they ended up at an overpass. One thing led to another, and eventually they started dropping rocks off the pass onto the traffic underneath. Thankfully, no one was injured in this ill-thought-out prank. It wasn't hard for police to find and catch the pair, and they were arrested and brought to the Department of Youth Services, where Bill and Faith would eventually come to collect Kip. Kip swore he didn't toss the rock, something that was believable on the whole, but contextually very hard. Kip was court-appointed a child psychologist, Dr. John Crumbly, for observation. Ultimately, Dr. Crumbly would report to the courts that Kip was notably remorseful for his actions and posed no threat to himself or others. He was sentenced to 32 hours of community service. Faith had hoped for more from the psychologist, and immediately after Kip's sentencing, she booked a series of appointments with another recommended child psychologist, Dr. Jeffrey Hicks. Bill was not too excited about the idea of extended treatment. He compared psychologists to chiropractors in the sense that they might not be as needed as we think, expensive and superfluous treatments. Faith was much more optimistic. She felt they had tried everything, and that this was one of the only options they had left. During the sessions, Kip did not display any kind of worrying trait, aside from admitting to having trouble sleeping and a change in eating habits. On the outside, Kip played the mostly convincing role of a perfectly normal teen in the midst of a hormone-driven rebellion. Dr. Hicks himself attributed much of Kip's anxiety to the strained relationship between him and his father, dismissing the thought that Kip might be experiencing any kind of serious mental illness like schizophrenia. Early onset schizophrenia is typically quite hard to diagnose, especially in children and teens. As the body begins the throes of puberty, the change in personality can often be mistaken for the normal rites of passage. Inconsistent grades at school, dropping old friends for new, a change in sleeping and eating patterns, all of it usually masked by depression, making diagnosis even more difficult. The psychologists typically have to rely on what the patient is telling them, and with paranoid schizophrenia, the big truths about how they are feeling usually go untold. Kip was no different. Tight-lipped about most of his turmoil, he was careful about what he shared with Dr. Hicks. Internally, however, the voices in his head were a constant, feeding paranoia and deteriorating self. Kip became fully invested in a number of perceived conspiracies. Initially, at least two stood out above the others. A brain chip in which he believed Disney Corporation had planted in his head, and an imminent Chinese invasion. These were the key driving force behind his growing collection of firearms and ammunition. Careful to not expose his motivations, Kip would often talk to Dr. Hicks about his passion for guns. A concerning topic, Dr. Hicks noted how excited Kip became, and although unhealthy, it was harmless, probably. He urged Bill and Faith to limit Kip's exposure to weapons, with a preference to remove it completely. But Bill disagreed. It was one of the only ways he and his son connected, and surprisingly, later went on to purchase another firearm for his son, a Glock handgun. Dr. Hicks quickly felt confident in diagnosing Kip and tells Bill and Faith that their son has major depressive disorder. A flood of new designer medicines created specifically to treat depression was steadily being pushed by drug administrations, and for the most part had shown marked improvement in treated patients. Fluoxetine, or commonly known as Prozac, was one of these relatively new drugs in the 90s. Used predominantly in adults, there was very little research into the efficacy for children, and its side and long-term effects were still largely unknown, even in adults. Even now, 20 years later, North America is one of the only countries that's approved fluoxetine, or Prozac, for pediatric administration. Part of Prozac's greatest effects are how it helps create new pathways in the brain and promote new brain cell generation. However, the effectiveness of this in children has been under global debate, as children already have active brains that do exactly what Prozac promotes. The potential side effects arguably outweigh the benefits. One thing is agreed upon amongst all professionals now is that coming off Prozac should be a long-term process. slowly weaning off the medication rather than a sudden stop. A sudden withdrawal from Prozac administration could result in heightened anxieties like intense depression or suicidal thoughts as the body struggles to adjust. Dr. Hicks himself was not specifically familiar with Prozac, or most importantly, the risks involved with pediatric administration. But in the era of blanket treatments and pharmaceutical kickbacks, Dr. Hicks felt fluoxetine was the right answer, for better or worse. Kip started taking Prozac, and Bill and Faith were overjoyed at the progress they were seeing in their son. Slowly, he was coming out of his shell. He was more social, and angry outbursts or blowouts almost ceased altogether. Kristen, now living in Hawaii, came to visit the family at some point during Kip's treatment, joining them on a trip out of town. She herself was amazed at the progress Kip had made. He was polite and courteous, opening doors or pulling chairs for his family. He was now very much a gentleman and seemed quite happy. Nearing 3 months after beginning Prozac, Bill and Faith are overjoyed with the results and believe their son is cured. They tell Dr. Hicks they want to stop the sessions and the Prozac. He was hesitant at first, but the Kinkels insisted, and eventually he agrees. The prescription was pulled and Kip stopped taking the medication. April 1998, and Kip's old habits started to make a quick return. First, he was suspended from school for assaulting a student who had allegedly pushed him, and then again, only 4 days after his return, for throwing a pencil at someone. Hoping this was simply a stumble in Kip's recovery, Bill and Faith were once again concerned, but had hoped this was an isolated incident or two. May 19th, and Kip continues to build his armory in preparation for the perceived Chinese invasion and protection from big industry like Disney. He'd collected, in part by his father and the rest illegally through friends at school, a collection of hunting knives, a stolen 20-gauge sawed-off shotgun, the 10-22 Ruger Bill had bought him, a .22 caliber handgun Kip had bought in the 9th grade and hid in the attic, a Marlin .336 Bill had given Kip, the Glock he had bought him, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. But to Kip, this was still not enough. Corey Ewart, one of Kip's friends, offers to sell him a stolen semi-automatic .32 Beretta for only $110. Kip immediately accepts the offer, and the next day at school makes the exchange. He hides the gun in his locker. Scott Keeney, the owner of the stolen gun and father of a child at Thurston, notices the gun is missing and immediately calls the school to report it, suspecting it was one of his son's friends. Detective Al Worthen was coincidentally at the school for a separate incident and starts an investigation into the stolen firearm. Scott's son, Aaron, gives police a list of names of possible suspects. Both Kip and Corey's names were not on the initial list. Kip was friends with Aaron and had gone on a few camping trips with him and his family. Father Scott later tells reporters that Kip was the last person they would have suspected. Eventually, running out of names, Kip was called to the office. Detective Worthen is waiting there, and Kip's bravado under interrogation quickly fades when he is told his locker will be searched. He confesses, telling Detective Worthen everything. Both Kip and Corey were suspended, pending expulsion, arrested, and escorted to the station in cuffs. Kip was charged with 2 felonies, one for receiving a stolen weapon, and the other for possession of a firearm in a public building. Kip sat alone in a holding cell until his father arrived around noon that day. Bill was feeling at a loss. They had tried everything to reach their son. psychologists, medications, stronger and stronger discipline, even attempting to meet Kip on his terms, showing acceptance and support of the things he was interested in, regardless of their individual views on things like firearms and violence. They'd always shown Kip an unwavering love, and they were nearing wit's end. On the ride home, Bill tells Kip if he can't turn things around, they'll be forced to send him to a boarding school. Bill and Kip stop at a local restaurant for lunch before heading home, and agree not to worry Faith with the news of Kip's expulsion right away. They get home around 2, and Bill heads to the kitchen to make some coffee, and Kip goes straight to his room. Over the next few hours, Bill makes a few hard calls to some close friends. He's desperate, and reaches out to the people he thinks can help, including a youth challenge program, a kind of survival camp for wayward sons. Bill wanted only the best for his boy, and was coming to a realization that maybe that was something he could not give him, or in the least without some third-party help. It's the last call Bill will ever make. Minutes after hanging up, Kip would use the .22 rifle his father bought him to shoot him through the head from behind, killing him instantly. Kip covers the body with a sheet. .30 and Faith is just arriving home. She still has no idea about Kip's arrest and suspension. She's happy to see her son, who helps her with some groceries before blocking her on the garage steps. "I love you," he tells her. Draws the Glock his father had gifted him, and shoots his mother once. Faith tumbles down the stairs. She's still breathing and opens her eyes to look at Kip. "Please, Mom, close your eyes," he pleads to her, and fires 2 more times, fatally shooting Faith in the head. He drags her to a corner in the garage and covers the body with a sheet. Kip would stay at the house, spending a sleepless night battling with his thoughts. The voices mocked him relentlessly, telling him heinous things. They tell him he had to murder his parents because he loved them, and that ultimately he has to murder more. He has no choice. At some point, Kip writes in his journal, "I've just killed my parents. I don't know what's happening. I love my mom and dad so much. I just got 2 felonies on my record. My parents can't take that. It would destroy them. The embarrassment would be too much for them. They couldn't live with themselves. I'm so sorry. I'm a horrible son. I wish I'd been aborted. I destroy everything I touch. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I didn't deserve them. They were wonderful people. It's not their fault or the fault of any other person, organization, or television show. My head just don't work right. God damn these voices in my head. I want to die. I want to be gone. But I have to kill people. I don't know why. I'm so sorry. Why did God do this to me? I've never been happy, and I wish I was happy. Wish I made my mother proud. I'm nothing. I tried so hard to find happiness. You know me. I hate everything. I have no other choice. What have I become? I'm so sorry. Thursday, May 21st, Kip is at home preparing to head to Thurston High. He listens to Liebstad from Romeo and Juliet while loading the handguns and the rifle, the latter of which had a 50-round magazine. He pulls on a long tan trench coat and hides the 3 firearms underneath. Under his pants, he tapes a hunting knife. He grabs his backpack, loaded with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, jumps in his mother's Ford Explorer, and drives to Thurston High, arriving around 7:30. He parks the Explorer a couple blocks away from the school and walks to the grounds, bumping into someone he knew on the way. He tells him to get clear and to head to the cafeteria. 7:55 a.m., and Kip enters the school. Staring down the mostly empty hallways, he pulls the Ruger from under his trench coat and fires off 2 rounds, injuring Ben Walker and Ryan Atterbury. He walks past them emotionlessly and enters the cafeteria. It was almost a ritual to meet in the school cafeteria before class, the perfect place to huddle with friends in different class blocks and talk about all the things teens do. It was a safe place, somewhere students could gather and gossip without being under the watchful eye of anything more than the student monitors. Kip makes his way to a table largely unnoticed and climbs on top. He pulls the Ruger rifle from under his trench coat and opens fire, letting loose the remaining 48 rounds. 23 students are injured in the volley, 2 of them critically, and 1 fatally. Mikael Nicolasen was a 17-year-old transfer student of sorts. Originally destined for a different high school, his parents felt that Thurston was the best school academically and safer, and him and his siblings were enrolled. Ambitious in his own right, Mikael had unusually clear goals for someone his age, and a well above average aptitude for computers and programming. He had a unique sense of honor, the old-fashioned kind, proving this only a week earlier when he and his girlfriend traveled to Portland to enlist in the Oregon National Guard. Mikael did not know Kip. Student Michael Crowley is near the table where Kip is perched, and Kip turns to him and takes aim. Michael froze. Kip pulls the trigger, but the rifle is empty. He drops the rifle and reaches for one of his handguns. Jacob Riker, one of the students shot and injured in the first volley, is laying close to Kip and sees an opportunity to take him down. He pulls himself to his feet and charges Kip, tackling him. They tumble to the ground.
Just almost casual, like just put the gun up against Mike's head and pulled the trigger, and then put it in my head, pulled the trigger, and then that's when I got up and hit him 3 times, and then he was tackled, and I ran into the office and told him to call 911, and people had been shot.
With Kip temporarily disabled, Jacob's brother Joshua, brothers Doug and David, and at least one other student rush in to join the fight. Kip is thrashing wildly as students overwhelm him, but not before he is able to draw the Glock 19 from his waist and fires several shots blindly into the huddle of attacking students. Jacob is hit once again. The student heroes are relentless, however, and continue their attack, eventually pinning Kip down, holding him there until authorities arrived. 8:04 a.m., Officer Dan Bishop is on scene and takes Kip into custody. Paramedics rush injured students to the hospital, 22 in total. Ben Walker, 16, had transferred to Thurston High in 1997. An academic choice, as Thurston was the best school in the district at the time. Ben was exactly the type of person you would think he is just by looking at his picture. Kind-hearted, gentle, and thoughtful, he quickly settled into the new environment at Thurston, making many great friends and meeting his girlfriend almost right away. The two were inseparable. Ben was declared brain dead at the hospital. In less than 24 hours after the shooting, his father makes the hard decision to pull him from life support. At Ben's funeral, Springfield Mayor Bill Morissette announced that Ben's organs had been donated to 12 other people, saving their lives. Kip is sitting in an interview room with his hands cuffed behind his back. It had been almost an hour, and he had still not been properly frisked. He was kind of just left alone while detectives figured out what to do. While alone, Kip stretched his cuffed hands from behind his back and retrieves the knife he had taped to his leg. When officers open the door, Kip charges them, knife in hand. "Just kill me," he screams. The door is quickly closed, and police prepare a breach team, opting for a non-lethal apprehension, leading with pepper spray. Realizing police were not going to shoot him, Kip turns the knife on himself, cutting his wrists as officers crack the door and douse the room. Kip is incapacitated and easily apprehended. He's frisked, finally, and treated for the pepper spray and knife wounds. Immediately after, detectives waste no time in conducting their interrogation. Kip is an emotional wreck and highly distressed. Led by the detectives' direct questions, Kip details each murder through sobs and tears, telling them he had no choice. The interrogation's recorded only on tape. The quality is poor and almost unlistenable. I wish I could have used this footage in the episode. However, it's available widely online and reposted to my Patreon. At 9:30 a.m., and investigators begin their search of the Kinkel home, discovering the bodies of Bill and Faith. During their search, they encountered a number of booby traps and IEDs, both live and inactive, including one under each of the bodies. They quickly evacuate the neighborhood and call the bomb squad. Once cleared, the squad noted how the bomb construction was immaculate, and that whoever made them had well above average skill. May 22nd, and Kip Kinkel is officially charged with 58 felony accounts, including 4 counts of aggravated murder for the killing of his parents, Bill and Faith, and the 2 teens at school, Ben Walker and Mikhail Nikolausen. Defense tried to present a case of mental health, a truthful approach, as Kip, although yet to be officially diagnosed, was suffering from some kind of mental issue. A number of professionals were called in and made assessments on Kip, the majority of them agreeing this could have been avoided if his mental health troubles had been diagnosed and treated earlier. Dr. Hicks, someone who had history with Kip and could testify based on long-term analysis, told the courts that Kip had great success with his limited treatment, and that he was in satisfactory mental health by the time his parents stopped therapy. On September 25, 1998, Kip Kinkel surprisingly pleads guilty to all counts, avoiding a trial, and on November 11th, he was sentenced to 112 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Kip was held at the Juvenile Detention Center in nearby Eugene, his only visitors his attorneys and sister Kristen. The majority of his time there was spent in solitary, a recognized form of torture that even the most tenured of inmates, both young and old, fear. For his own safety, guards would argue. However, alone, with very little outside stimuli, Kip's voices were free to run wild, and they did. The center would eventually treat Kip when they could, but it was inconsistent and likely something the guards believed was a ruse, a long con to win an appeal. On his 16th birthday, dictated by the terms of his sentence, Kip was transferred to Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem, a medium-security prison for adults. Kip was understandably fearful of this new atmosphere, and during intake was instructed by guards on how to navigate the cold, uncaring, and potentially violent environment to which he would forever call home. He was purposely placed in a cell with an inmate who had followed a similar path through the justice system, and they made friends immediately. Conrad Engweiler, also once a juvenile offender sentenced to adult jail, was asked by guards to help with Kip's transition, and Joe, Conrad, and Kip became fast friends. They would help him navigate the new inmate code, dispelling many myths of serving hard time. Prison is a community just like any other, but here you earn your respect. Fight if someone attacks you, they tell Kip. Say nothing and go with the guards peacefully. You'll go to solitary, but you'll have earned your stripes. Inevitably, Kip is attacked and he fights back. As expected, he is sent to solitary confinement for a month and returned to general population, a proper inmate. Kip would remain absent from the headlines for 9 years until June of 2007, when he resurfaced only because he was ready to seek a new trial. He had hoped that, now being officially diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, the courts might see things in a different light. He enlisted a few psychologists, all of which supported his claims. But only 2 months later, in August, the trial was denied, and in January of 2011, his appeal against that decision was also shelved. Kip had grown into a new person in prison. He was under treatment and no longer hearing voices. He was an active member of the prison liveries and workshops and made good friends with a strong support system surrounding him. Some of them inmates, others advocacy groups, and his ever-loyal sister, Kristen. She never forgot her brother and still visits and writes him regularly. In 2018, Oregon moved to join the growing number of states that were amending and changing how laws applied to youth offenders. Titled Bill 1008, if passed, it would eliminate mandatory adult sentencing and life without parole for young offenders. A long line of investigators contributed to the bill, including strong support from the Oregon Department of Corrections and the Oregon Youth Authority. However, in the lead up to the vote, many would invoke Kip's name as a direct protest. He had become the boogeyman in Oregon. His name was Dark Legend, powerful and recognized. Kip had become a true martyr. Sadly, the public failed to, or simply didn't want to see, the dramatic reform Kip had undergone.
A bill making its way through the Oregon legislature is stirring up controversy tonight before a scheduled public hearing tomorrow. Lane County District Attorney Patty Perlow says she thinks the bill would be a bad idea. Perlow says Senate Bill 1008 would repeal Measure 11 for juveniles, which have been in place for the last 24 years. And she says she thinks it could impact high-profile cases from our area, like Thurston shooter Kip Kinkel. Perlow says if Senate Bill 1008 were to pass, it would give juveniles a maximum sentence to no matter Measure 11 crime they committed, like rape, assault, and homicide. She says the number of victims and charges wouldn't matter, and that the parole board isn't supposed to consider the crimes someone committed or their victims. Instead, they would look at how much the offender has matured.
It's just a terrible, terrible idea to completely revoke Juvenile Measure 11 without taking into consideration some of the crimes that have been committed in the past, the way communities have been victimized, and what can happen in the future.
Local Senator Floyd Prozac, who helped write that bill, says past cases won't be affected by this bill. He says Perlow and others that are against the bill are simply trying to use scare tactics. He says this bill would eventually help juvenile offenders.
Based on what we know is that the outcomes are better when you actually have the youth going through the youth system, because they have a much more opportunity to make changes.
The bill has already been passed in the Oregon Senate and is scheduled for a public hearing in the House of Representatives tomorrow. Prozac tells us that he believes the House will pass this measure.
Senate Bill 1008 passed the Senate floor this morning. It's part of a package of bills aimed at giving juvenile offenders a better chance at rehabilitation. The proposals would walk back mandatory minimum sentencing requirements established under Measure 11. They'd also eliminate life sentences for juveniles. Ballot Measure 11, passed by voters in 1994, requires some teenagers to be prosecuted as adults for the most serious crimes. Supporters argue young people deserve a second chance because adolescent brains aren't fully developed, and there's a better chance for rehabilitation in a juvenile facility. Critics believe voters should decide.
I'm voting yes because I have not given up on the young people, the children of Oregon, my Oregon, who've got themselves in trouble. I expect more of them, and I'd like to believe that by taking this vote, they're going to step up.
What about the victims? A murder victim, do they get a second chance? Does their family get a second chance?
Senate Bill 1008 now goes to the House for consideration. It needs the support of 2/3 of state lawmakers in each chamber to pass, since the bill alters voter-approved sentencing laws. Governor Brown has said she supports the juvenile justice reform.
The bill would never be retroactive anyways. None of them ever are, meaning that convicted youth currently serving life sentences would not be affected. But there was a glimmer of hope. Any retrial or resentence that happened after the bill passed would have the new legislation apply, effectively overthrowing any previous decision. April of 2019, and Bill 1008 passes. The public quickly realized the sentencing loophole, however, and fears that Kip specifically might walk free sent them into a frenzy. Quickly and quietly, another bill was passed that closed that hole in their language, and any hope of a retrial for Kip was lost. Later, the Supreme Court would amend the bill further, once again allowing a judge to sentence a youth to life without parole. Kip Kinkel is currently serving the rest of his 112-year sentence at Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem. He has no chance of parole.
He told me earlier he took 2 knives, the Ruger 1022 that was sawed off, a Ruger 22 caliber pistol, and the Glock 19, which is a 9mm. Is that correct? Yes. And you took those to school. Okay. Okay. You were wearing a big overcoat. Were you hiding the weapons? Yes. Okay. Why were you hiding? Didn't know what else to do. Why did you go to school and start shooting people?
I had to. I had no other choice. I couldn't do anything else.
Had you been stopped by a police officer before you got to school? Would you have done that?
I don't know.
Okay. Why did you feel that you didn't have a choice with the kids in school?
I don't know. I can't.
once again for watching or listening. Surprisingly, this monumental case in American history is not something I was familiar with. Happening at a time before Columbine, but on the crest of the school shooting flood, the far-reaching effects of this case are still felt today. I want to thank Snagger M2D Manuel for recommending this story. It's truly been an intriguing case to study. Thank you. I have a Patreon, the key source of income for my channel. YouTube and its strange algorithm does not agree with my content, and the majority of my channel remains demonetized. An artistic choice anyways, outside Patreon and hopefully one day a sponsor. I prefer to keep each episode largely ad-free anyways, so as to preserve artistic vision. My patrons truly are my producers. Bridget Delacroix, Stop Drop, Brett David, Nubian Goddess, Kristen Bronikowski, Beverly Pickett, Anna, Gina, Bose Arieli, Bales Marriott, Layla Sabbath, Byron Lambert, Michael Horgan, Ashley Ortiz, CJ Bosco, Jason Wilson. Thank you. I have some big ideas for episode 4, although I never truly know what's next until I do. So please, keep the recommendations coming. Most, if not all, end up in my research folder, and I'm confident I will get to them one day. Until next time, thank you once again for joining me in this episode of Something Criminal.
Close all the curtains. Stay on the phone. We are the monsters holding you still. We are the gallows up on the hill. Answer the question. Is God on your side? We'll be together. We're the rebel tide. We are the monster. There's no place to hide. We're under your bed. We hide in the dark. We are the monster. An army of one. We are the monster. We're holding the sun. You're the beginning. We are the end. You